So the first thing to remember is that Africa is enormous. If you look on the map there, using the website I showed you before we broke up, you can see Vietnam and Korea compared to Rwanda, and it shows you exactly where Rwanda is. So Rwanda's not a big country, but it's part of this huge, great, big continent. Within Rwanda, there is a history of two different ethnic groups, two different peoples. One of them are the Tutsis, and one of them are the Hutus. The Tutsis traditionally have been more privileged. When Europeans first came to Africa to take over the continent, Germans took over Rwanda, and they gave most of the power to Tutsis. Obviously, the Hutus didn't like this. They were the majority, and so there was lots of resentment. After the First World War, Belgium takes over Rwanda, and they give everybody ID cards. And so now, if you were a Tutsi or a Hutu, that's what you would be and your family would be forever. And it meant that if you were a Hutu, you had no chance of becoming one of the more important people in society. By the 1960s, this leads to a great big civil war. There is lots of fighting, and so Belgium decides that it will start to give Hutus more power. It gives them elections, and it lets people choose who they want to be in charge. Obviously, the majority of people choose Hutus. And so now, the Tutsis are the ones who aren't being treated very well. Lots of them are forced to leave Rwanda. At the same time, there is a very big increase in population. And so it becomes harder and harder for people to get land and resources in Rwanda. By 1991, a civil war breaks out. Tutsis and Hutus are so angry with each other, they can't stop fighting. The president of Rwanda is assassinated in 1994. He's killed, and nobody knows who did it. By this point, the Hutus are blaming the Tutsis, and there begins this massive campaign of killing. Hutus go on the radio and tell everyone to go out and start killing cockroaches. That's what they called the Tutsis. And over the next 100 days, 1 million people, or around 1 million people, are killed. So I think you'll agree that's a real great disaster, massive scale. 1 million people almost wiped out in 100 days, which was around 10,000 people per day. And when you start to look at the evidence of it, and you see just how big in scale it is, it's really upsetting. It's a huge, huge event. And so what I want to do next is talk you through some of the evidence, and there are some questions for you to answer. You really need to look carefully at what that means. Okay, the first thing you need to do is to go onto our class notebook, and you can find it here. All the information that we'll use this week is going to be on there, and scroll down to the sources at the end. This first source shows us, using the red arrow or the x-axis at the bottom, that as people got closer to a radio or had more access to a radio, they were more likely to commit acts of collective or group violence. So they were more likely to go out as a group and commit violence if they had heard the radio. And that links up to the story I told you about Hutus calling Tutsis cockroaches on the radio. Next, we can see some statistics about Rwanda. So at the bottom here, where it talks about literate, percentage literate, and literacy rates, that means how many people could read and write. And it shows us that over 90% of Tutsis could read or write, but only 50% of Hutus. There are lots of other things as well that shows us the difference between those groups. Next, we can see newspaper articles which explain to us how after the president was assassinated, there was lots of confusion. Nobody knew who was in charge, and nobody really knew what to do. And that allowed some of the groups who were going out and committing violence to do it without the police stopping them. Finally, you can see in this piece of evidence exactly what some people did during the genocide, what caused them to do it, and why they did it. And very interestingly, you can hear them talk about it at the end. So what I need you to do with all that information, first of all, is to answer the questions on each of those sources. You can write those in your class notes in your section of the notebook, or you can write them by hand if you have your textbook with you. Okay, I think that's probably going to take between 1 and 2 lessons. And so what I want you to do after that is I want you to write me an essay. As a minimum, this should include 3 paragraphs answering the question, why did the genocide in Rwanda happen? And so you need to pick out what you think are the 3 most important factors, causes, which led to this genocide occurring. You need to make sure that not only do you make your point, but you include evidence from the evidence I've given you. So you need to actually pick out some facts and figures, some statistics, maybe some words that someone who was involved had actually said. And you need to explain why that is the case. If you know you can do better than that, then your extension task is to add an evaluation paragraph at the end, where you decide which factor was the most important and why. It could be one of the 3 that you've mentioned, or you might want to talk about how this is so much more complicated than just picking one factor. And so some of these things mix together, and you might explain how maybe 1 or 2 mix together to create a new reason, a new factor, which you can talk about a little bit more in your conclusion. All together, I think combined, that is your 3 hours worth of work done. When you've completed your essay, I would like you to upload it to the assignment section on Teams, and if possible, during the lesson, I may be able to give you feedback immediately. I'll certainly be able to talk to you on Teams, and let's see, you may be able to get something back straight away, but I will be available to talk to. Okay.